Here we are, midwinter, in the rain, the wind. I think it's a good time to talk about cynicism, that ancient Greek philosophical position which has become a 21st century addiction. It's interesting living in a parliamentary democracy where theoretically change is possible through exerting pressure on parliamentary representatives. Now, over the last 55 years as an activist, the greatest single barrier to change is not the institutional structures that we wish to change, or the hierarchical relationships, or the inequalities in power and wealth. It's the fact that in the 21st century most people do not believe that change is possible. Some believe it's desirable, but most don't believe it's possible. To a significant degree, every aspect of our existence has been incorporated into the state apparatus. How we live, how we interact, how we're monitored has become a significant issue of 21st century life. And in that type of environment, which we see exaggerated in dictatorial countries, you begin to understand why cynicism has reached such epidemic proportions in society. But the problem is that if we allow cynicism to regulate and dominate our thinking, whether as individuals or communities or nation states, change becomes impossible, because ultimately cynicism is the aphrodisiac of the ruling classes, that 1% that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and their parliamentary puppets. Without cynicism, their authority would be challenged. And it's no accident that in the 21st century, in the Me Too society, that cynicism has reached such pandemic proportions, not just epidemic, not just in this country, but pandemic. We see everywhere that ability or that desire for change, especially egalitarian change, disappearing, or has disappeared almost completely from the political, social, community discourse. It's not about fundamental change, it's about change at the periphery. Life is all about change at the periphery. It's not about looking at the building blocks of society, not looking at the building blocks of the private investment for private profit mantra that dominates every aspect of our existence. So ultimately, that fear of freedom and that fear of change is tied up with a general attitude of cynicism in society. And that cynicism is much more acute in a parliamentary democracy or representative democracy than it is in a dictatorial society. In a dictatorial society, what we have is the state or the ruling clique exercising absolute power and using the means of control to dominate society. And in such a society, it's not about cynicism, it's about fear. Fear is real. The consequences are real. In in a parliamentary democracy where there is the illusion of change, the illusion that change is possible, where the process is encapsulated in a 3 to 4 yearly mania of casting a ballot in order to elect representatives, we find that the enemy, or that section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, is so nebulous, so difficult to define, so difficult to see, that cynicism reigns supreme. In a dictatorial regime, everybody knows who's responsible for that situation. Obviously, fear dominates the relationships in that society, and it's a fear founded on facts. People disappear, people are imprisoned, people are expelled, people's futures are ruined because they work against the dominant ideology. But in a society like Australia, where that oppression is difficult to define, where people think that the situation they find themselves in is related to the other, the person of a different colour, the person of a different religion, the person who's a migrant, the person who's a First Nations person, that somehow we think it's somebody else. We are encouraged to believe it's always somebody else, and that we live in the best country in the world. I mean, if I hear that word again, I'm going to vomit. The reality is that the power structures which exist in the society are just as powerful, just as strong as those in a dictatorial community. The main reason that the iron fist hasn't been taken out of the velvet glove in this society is due to the fact that we are so marginal and irrelevant. If there's one thing I don't have, it's illusions that the ideas that we promote, the campaigns we're involved in, are considered to be marginal, irrelevant. Whenever those that dominate their societies, their power is challenged, we see the legislative agenda coming out of Parliament which introduces draconian legislation. And the problem in Australia, unlike many other countries, so-called parliamentary democracies around the world, is that we have no constitutional protection for the individual against the arbitrary exercise of state power. So every time the state, or that 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication that pull the parliamentary strings, feel threatened, legislation is passed to restrict the ability of the individual and of groups to initiate campaigns and activities which promote change, not just reform, not just radical change, but reform. Because that is the fundamental problem, is cynicism. Cynicism in a population which has forgotten that ultimate political power in a democratic society is not in the hands of the state, not in the hands of that 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. It's not in the hands of the police or the armed forces or the courts. Ultimate power in a democratic society, a society based on rule of the people, by the people, for the people, ultimately is in the hands of the people. And when you live in a society which calls itself democratic, which is not fundamentally democratic, where you see increasing inequalities as far as power is exercised is concerned, and wealth is produced and distribute it, you begin to understand the difficulty that activists, radical activists, face in this country. In order for direct action to be successful, you need a mass movement. In order to have a mass movement, you need direct action. And we find ourselves in this situation where most people, the great majority, say, why bother? What's the point? Change can't occur. Let me survive the best way I can. Let me survive, let my family, let's put the interests of my family and myself above the interests of everything else, above the interests of a community, above the interests of the state, above the interest of the nation. It's my existence which is the fundamental core of the belief system in a private investment for private profit society. That's why we see, when it comes to the matter of pandemics, so much resistance to people adopting sensible approaches, not just to minimise exposure to themselves, but to the community as a whole and those around them. So we no longer have any type of collectivist viewpoint. It's about individualism. Individualism to its extreme. Not individualism in terms of just developing yourself to the maximal potential. Not individualism in terms of your own relationships, but individualism in terms of being able to acquire as much wealth as possible in a short period of time, not taking any account or interest in anybody else. And the response to the COVID-19 pandemic highlights the fact that we have forgotten how to act in a collectivist manner and take an interest in the common good. As you can see, the rain is now pouring down. We'll continue. So the rain has settled down and I'm still here, for good or for bad. So how do you overcome this cynicism? I think one way over the last half a century I found is to embark on campaigns that have the possibility of success. That doesn't mean we forget about the long-term aims of creating an egalitarian community where we devolve power and hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. But we embark on campaigns with those principles in mind which encourage people to come involved. There's nothing worse than creating cynicism by being involved in campaigns and activities that have no chance whatsoever of being successful. Community attitudes come and go. Community attitudes change. What people think is important one day is unimportant the next. In a country like Australia, where we tend to live for the present and forget about the past, we don't seem to have any guiding principles in terms of campaigns which promote change. I mean, there's two types of campaigns. Those where you're outside the tent and you're throwing stones at the tent, and those where you're inside the tent. It's important to use every legal mechanism available to you to promote campaigns which revolve around sharing power and holding wealth in common and using it for the common good. Public interest before corporate interest was set up for that very purpose. We're not just an issue-orientated group. We're a group that looks at the fundamentals of society, that looks at the building blocks of society based on private investment for private profit. We're a group that understands that change is not only desirable, but is possible. And it's possible through people like you becoming involved in activities which promote change. There are many activities in life which can be easily incorporated into a private investment for private profit mantra. And we've seen this with the so-called green energy, the rise and rise of green energy as an alternative to the destructive fossil fuels which are endangering every living thing on this planet. But the problem is, it's moved in a private investment for private profit direction. So when you're looking at issues, the solutions we should be looking at and promoting are solutions which devolve power and share wealth. They're solutions which are collectivist, not individual. They're solutions which ensure the commonwealth is used for the common good. Now again, this may sound a little bit airy-fairy and theoretical, but the fact is that you are in a position to be involved in activities which promote change, which promote radical change. Currently, I'm toying with the idea of standing against Mr. Andrews in the Victorian state seat of Mulgrave, not because I have anything against Mr. Andrews, not because, I believe in conspiracy theories, not because I believe in rumours or innuendos, but because I'm interested in a debate about ideas and policies. I find it extraordinary that in 2022 we have a state government and a federal government that is always willing to put the private investors' motives before the community, that the interests of the few are always put before the interests of the many, that we have a state government which cannot even satisfy the basic human needs of its population, human needs like food security, housing, education, health, recreation, while at the same time indulging in construction blitzes which provide little to assist the community. So as I said at the beginning, cynicism is an attitude that we need to battle. Because while cynicism reigns supreme as the dominant ideological basis, the dominant community sentiment in this country, while it reigns supreme, the chances of change are minimal, if non-existent. We need to understand that ultimately real power lies in the hands of the people. Democracy is about rule of the people, by the people, for the people. It has very little to do with the situation we find ourselves in. While inequalities in power and wealth grow, the chances of change decrease. But what's important, that during this period we don't succumb to cynicism, because as I said before, cynicism is the aphrodisiac of those who rule us. Because if cynicism continues to be the major position we hold as individuals and as a community, the chances for change are non-existent, because people will not become involved in activities to change society, to share power, to share wealth, unless they think there is a possibility that change is possible. History is littered with examples of people who've taken the initiative, who've created the social community conditions which have promoted change, not just reform, not just change at the edges, but radical change based on the devolution of power and the holding of wealth in common and using that wealth for the common good. I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interest today. It's very simple. Just go to the website. You can join online. If you're not able to join online, we can always send you an application form.